So, this is Nandy, MP for Wigan. I've been talking to a number of people about the Open Drive, and I guess I'm beginning to think it's all a bit London-centric. So the interesting thing about being able to talk to you is to find out a bit more about how it feels in your part of the forest, and something about the differences maybe between how your constituents are feeling and how they feel about the Southerners. So I suppose the first question is really, we've been talking a lot about solidarity, and is solidarity dead? Is this something about the old past of the great days of the Labour Party that will never come back? Mm-hmm. How does solidarity feel in Wigan?
The first thing is that community is still, I think, relatively strong in Wigan. And when I say in Wigan, I represent a constituency that has quite diverse areas. Mm-hmm. But I think that generally people tend to live nearer to their families than they do in parts of London and elsewhere, and have a very strong connection to their families, no different generations. A lot of people who I represent were born and brought up in the area and have lived there all their life, and so they are very acutely aware of the impact that they have on the people around them. People are generally very strong and supportive of one another. Doesn't mean to say we don't have problems, social problems and others. We do, of course we do. But I think that sense of community is really helpful, because it helps to sustain people when things are difficult, and those strong relationships. And I think that helps to foster a sense of solidarity, but I think that solidarity is something that you have to work at. So at the moment, for example, I've got workers at a local bakery, the Hovis Bakery, who are out on strike. They're out on strike because they don't want other workers to be brought in as agency workers on low rates of pay to them. They're not directly under threat, but they don't want a two-tier workforce. As one man put it to me, I don't want to know that the guy I'm working alongside is earning less than me and has fewer rights than me. So I think there is still a very strong sense of solidarity. I think with that sort of town, it's a town that has a strong history of mining, where of course you had to have solidarity and look after the person next to you, and I think that still exists very strongly. I wouldn't like to speculate about whether that doesn't exist elsewhere though. I was a councillor in London for a while, and I think there is, you know, some of that, but I think it's something that you have to work at, and it's undeniable that a lot of the things that happened in the 80s and 90s, they isolated people. You know, the poverty and the strain that individuals and families were under meant that people retreated into themselves, and those bonds were not broken but weakened. And I think that we have a really big job to do to try and rebuild some of that.
I've just been reading the David Goodhart's book, which is sort of arguing that people find it much harder to feel a sense of solidarity and community with people who are not like them. Mm-hmm. And obviously, even in Wigan, the population is a lot more diverse than it has been in the past. Diverse ethnically, diverse religious diversity. Does that make it harder for people to feel a sense of connection?
I think that one of the difficulties in areas that aren't as diverse as others is that people don't necessarily know people who are different from them. So one of the problems that teachers talk to me about in schools in Wigan is that there is some racism about people from other backgrounds, and that, I think, comes from children in some schools not ever meeting somebody who comes from a different racial background from them. So we have a different sort of challenge actually. We have a challenge to get people to understand things that aren't necessarily in front of them, rather than the challenges that exist in more multicultural areas.
Because it's interesting, I mean, I was thinking about this in terms of London. I live in Islington, which is a very diverse place. I walk down the street, I hear loads of languages, I meet people from all sorts of different backgrounds, but only in the street. You know, actually, I've got no Somali friends, I've got no Greek or Turkish friends, you know, so actually there's some interesting statistics that show that almost half the population nationally say they have friends from a different ethnic background, but most people still tend to not move across those divides.
I think that one of the problems is that people always look for someone to define themselves against. I think when people are having a hard time, it's very easy to find other groups to blame it on and to scapegoat. So in Wigan, like in so many other areas of the country, there are tensions between younger and older people. There are tensions with other nationalities, and there are tensions with people from other areas. But actually, the reality is that it's almost hypothetical. So the reality is that we are pretty welcoming to people who come from outside. We have a lot of people who come in as asylum seekers who are supported by a group called SWAP, which is a new arrivals project, which is extremely active and extremely welcoming. We have obviously intergenerational work going on because families are very close. Actually, I think what you'll find in Wigan is that people are more upset about people from St Helens because of their rugby club or from Lee than they are about people coming in from Somalia or somewhere else.
So in terms of the political project, I mean, what is it that political parties, your party, the Labour Party, might need to do more of differently in order to create a more collaborative culture? I
think one of the problems for all of the major political parties has been the centralisation of politics, and that to me seems to have particularly coincided with the media, and this need to have a kind of clean, coordinated message has sort of taken the life out of politics. It's ended up in this position where we're all sort of supposed to pretend that we agree with each other all the time, when of course we don't, and we shouldn't. You know, some of the things that we deal with are hugely complicated, and they aren't black and white, and there are upsides and downsides to wherever you end up and whatever decision you make. And I think most people would find that reassuring to know that those debates are being had not just between political parties but within them, that we understand the complexity of what we're dealing with. And I think things are starting to change, and I think that will help not just to sort of attract more people into the debate and help them to feel like it's relevant and it's important, but I also think then it'll help us to get out into communities and be more rooted. The sort of centralisation process that I talked about has kind of taken the life out of local politics as well. And the thing about that for Labour is that I think it's been a bigger issue than for any other political party, because Labour's strength has always come from its grassroots. It's the fact that we are funded by and we are supported by millions of ordinary people in communities across the country. It's not just that gives us the understanding of what needs to change, but then when you're in a position like Ed Miliband or John Cruddas or me as a Member of Parliament, it gives you the place you can go back to understand what's really happening, to hear that feedback that you don't get in a place like this. So I think that it's starting to change. I think it's starting to change, but it's changing quite slowly, and it can't happen fast enough.
And I've heard a lot of people say actually the problem feels like there's no way in to political parties to influence them anymore. I mean, after all, the party conference no longer decides policy. Yeah. There's a sort of feeling even amongst the membership that in any of the three main parties you can't impact on what they're doing. It's all being fixed somewhere else. Is that?
Yeah, and I think partly as well that's been because we've sort of lost that representative role in the constituencies. And I know that a lot of Compass members were very keen on seeing proportional representation introduced, but one of the reasons that I think that AV is, that first past the post is in a sense the least worst system, is because you still have that constituency link, that where you have people who come from their communities and are rooted in their communities coming here, you see the debate start to change. You see issues getting onto the agenda that never were on the agenda before. Too often the stuff that we talk about in here is dictated by a small group of people who are based in London and have quite privileged lives, and so we talk endlessly about electoral reform, about the House of Lords, about splits within the coalition, about splits within the parties, Nick versus Dave and so on, and we don't talk often enough about the things that people talk about in Wigan. And I think that where you have people who are rooted in their communities, that starts to change, because actually we're accountable to them. I can't walk down the main street in Wigan without people coming up to me and telling me what they think. And that's the way you really can influence political parties, is through your own representative, or through people becoming much more accessible and much more part of their communities.
So what might we do in our political life that would accelerate that trend, to be able to hear more from the regions and ordinary people?
I think that it's happening from the grassroots already to an extent. I think that what you're seeing is people expressing themselves in different ways to political parties, and political parties starting to wake up and understand that that's a problem for them. So, for the last 3 years we've seen people taking to the streets over things like tuition fees, the EMA, austerity, cuts to benefits for people with disabilities, and so on. And I think we've also seen, the Occupy movement and lots of other groups springing up in protest at various different things. Some of them, I think, quite interestingly, not just about single issues, but about a sort of broad set of values that they want to see reflected in political debate. And I think that, in a sense, is working quite well. Where it's not working well enough is from the top down. So we've got to see party leaders loosening up and understanding that in this day and age it just doesn't work to have one message drilled into every person who's part of or representative to a party that they repeat like robots. It just can't work. It doesn't work with the public, but it also can't work in an era where we're instantly accessible to people. Where I'm the Shadow Children's Minister, I have conversations with people on Twitter that they want to raise, and they pose questions to me about my views, and I can't wait to go and have a summit and get a briefing and formulate a soundbite. I mean, it's not going to work, but anyway, and I wouldn't want to do it, but I can't wait to do that. So.
But isn't there a sort of tension between complexity and Twitter? I mean, that if
Sure.
issues are very complex, and if solutions are going to require a lot of ingenuity and some hard thinking, isn't there also a danger that the Twitter-Facebook world wants sort of simple flash solutions?
Yeah, I think it depends how you use it. I mean, I found Twitter complex enough without having to deal with the complexity of messaging as well. But I mean, there are some things that are just not appropriate even to discuss over Twitter. One of my responsibilities is child protection. I'm not going to discuss some of that over Twitter. It's just not appropriate. And you're right that some of these issues are really, really complicated, and you can't do them justice in 140 characters or whatever it is. But it depends how you use those sorts of mediums. So you can say to people, drop me an email, or I've had lots of people talk to me about this, so I've posted something on a website, give me your feedback, comment on it, tweet at me, tell me what you think, and you can use it as a sort of feedback loop, a sort of echo, because you don't get it in here otherwise. One of the great problems I think with politics at a national level is that we all spend most of the week in here with each other and not outside with people who think differently and are talking about different things, and then you get this uniformity that is ever more divorced from the real world, and that's a problem for all of us.
And you're younger than most other MPs.
Ageing fast.
Ageing, well, not yet, I don't think, but therefore a bit closer than probably many of your colleagues to the issue that lots of people have been talking to me about, which is that basically for 18 to 35-year-olds, the world of Westminster and the world of conventional politics just looks weird.
Yeah, well, it is weird.
Are we in danger of just losing young people to democracy?
I don't think so, because I think that I worked with children and young people before I came into Parliament, and have done since on the Education Select Committee and then in my current job. I don't think that young people are any less political now than they ever were. I think they're deeply political. I think they have really, really strong views about themselves and the world around them, their lives, their communities, and all sorts of issues. The only group that I speak to regularly where you never know what issues are going to come up, it could be Syria, it could be international aid, it could be the Constitution, it could be the local park, are children and young people. So I think that they care passionately, but I think quite often they lack the tools and the means to influence things. They're not necessarily inspired by some of the things that they see, and it's our challenge, I think, because a lot of the young people I meet, they haven't switched off. They are engaging, but they don't know how to do it. I think we need to help give young people the tools to do that, not just through the education system, but just through the real world, by giving them actual power, especially at a local level, to be able to make some decisions and have some control. And I also think that we need to inspire better. I think Caroline Lucas got it absolutely right when she said that with all of the major parties over the sort of previous 15 years wedded to one sort of vision for public services, that the millions of people who thought differently were denied a voice, and I think that's right, and I think we're starting to see a bit more diversity. But I also feel really strongly that we need to try to encourage those young people who look at the system and think, my God, why would I ever do that? They're exactly the people that we need in here. My big worry is that there are still young people coming through, and some of them are absolutely fantastic, but my worry is that too many of them are the ones who look at the system as it is and think, yeah, I want to be part of that. I want those young people who look at the system and think, never in a million years, that system is completely broken, and they're the ones I want to see as the next members of Parliament coming through.
It always used to be assumed that young people were to the left of old people. At least it was when I was young.
Define old. I'm concerned about it.
But there's quite a bit of polling evidence at the moment that the younger cohort are a bit less generous about welfare and a bit more hard-hearted about people needing to pull their socks up and sort themselves out. Does that mean that assumption that young people are to the left of old people is no longer true, do you think?
Yeah, I think it's dangerous anyway to make generalisations about any age group. I think that you get a real diversity of views. I do think that something has shifted over the years. I think it would be very odd if you'd had the Thatcher era, sort of 80s greed and individualism that largely went unchallenged then for another 15 years. I think it would be very odd if out of all of that, which has lasted for my entire lifetime, if you didn't have young people now who didn't feel less inclined to support values of solidarity and social justice. I think we're all a product of the society that we live in and that we grow up in. I think it's fairly obvious why some of that's happened, but I don't think it's irreparable. And I also think that there are lots of people who feel a very strong sense of solidarity. You just can't generalise. I'm a big supporter of votes at 16. I think for me, democracy is one of those things where it's not a question of why would you extend the franchise, it's a question of why not. And if you don't have really valid reasons not to, then you should. But I don't believe for a second that if we extended the franchise to 16 and 17-year-olds, that they would all turn around and vote Labour or Green. Some of them would vote UKIP, some of them might vote for the BNP, some of them might vote for the Conservatives, but God, at least they'd be part of the debate, and then we could start having the argument properly and they could start making those decisions for themselves.
And if we wanted to win young people over to a sense of social collaboration and social generosity and tax paying and what's at stake? What do we need? What would need to happen to do that?
And I don't really think that young people particularly need winning over. I meet a lot of young people in Wigan who are political and have political views but don't realise that they do. And when they realise that they do, they don't know where to go with them and they don't know how to exercise them. And the ones who try quite soon find that there isn't really anywhere to go where you get real power. You might get listened to, but then nothing happens afterwards. I think one of the things that we could do is that we could start devolving some power to young people locally. The reason that I say locally is because I think that what that enables young people to do is see that they're making an impact on their local communities. It doesn't require huge amounts of money. You don't have to travel down to London to do it. You don't have to change things. And once you can see that you're making an impact, once you've learnt some of the tools for how you make change happen, gives you the confidence to then try and make that leap into national change and national impact. I think that some of the things that we do, some of the practices that we have in the Labour Party but in Compass and in other organisations really exclude those sorts of young people from the national debate. So, for example, the Compass conference is always held in London. Now, I don't know about most young people, but the young people that I represent, my youth officer comes occasionally to the Compass conference. He has to fork out 30, 40, 50 quid for a ticket. That is a lot of money for someone of his age who doesn't earn a huge amount of money. And for most of the young people I represent, that is completely prohibitive. It's also that the way that we select young people to be on panels means that it tends to be those young people who've been most involved in the debate so far. Well, that's, perhaps rightly that's one way of doing it, but if we don't recognise that our practices are excluding people, we never find ways to let the sort of young people I represent in Wigan enter the debate and get involved. So I think there are a huge number of things that we can do, but I think we all have to look at ourselves to say, are we doing enough? Probably not.
One of the conversations I was in the other day was really just about how boring politics is.
Yeah.
And yeah, actually, it's the most fascinating subject on the planet because it's about, war and the future of humanity and all sorts of things. Are there things that we can just do to make political meetings more fun, more exciting, make them cooler?
I think it's not just about meetings. Actually, I think it's also about politics and the language that we use and the way we present it and the opening up of the debate. About really saying what you think as a national politician rather than just reading off a briefing sheet. So I think it's partly about inspiring people by presenting different views and not being frightened to, about being human and talking in language that people understand. I think too often what I end up seeing is people sort of mimicking each other, adopting each other's language and slogans and mannerisms, and it just doesn't, it turns people off. It's not just boring for young people, it's boring for everybody, and it bores me. I mean, I can't speak for other political parties, but I think in the Labour Party at times the problem is that it becomes about process and not about ideas. I think there are some local parties around the country who've done phenomenal things to change that, debating the ideas and getting in speakers and making it about the issues and so on, but the problem always comes back to this thing about power. If you have this great debate, people get excited and energised, and it is also a huge sort of political education role as well, because for most of my party members, they're too busy to spend all day reading political pamphlets. They come to GC meetings so they can debate these ideas and be exposed to them and think about them and give their views. But if that doesn't go anywhere, if that's it, that's pretty soul destroying. So it comes back to this point about where's the power for local grassroots members? How do you actually influence change? That's something that I know my party's been working on for a while with Peter Haines refounding Labour, but it's something that I don't think we've yet found a proper solution to.
You said something about being human, and what human is part of my inquiry, I think, increasingly. You watch politicians on television being wooden and sort of terrified of saying anything that they really feel in case it's not what they're supposed to say, and you feel that's not very human. They look like they're being a robot. Humans make mistakes, say stupid things, laugh, make jokes. They don't just behave like interviewees being interviewed by Paxman.
I was thinking about this the other day. I was talking to some young people just down the road, and we were talking about exactly this, and we were talking about Vince Cable and what happened to him when he was set up by a national newspaper, and some journalists posing as constituents came along to his surgery, and he was completely honest with them, as you would hope that an MP would be with his local constituents, and it ended up all over the papers and was this huge scandal and ended up in him having to be taken off the brief and so on. And I think that the trouble is that things like that, they really impact wider than just on that individual, that other politicians will look at that and think, Christ, I've got to be really, really careful about what I say and what I do, even in the most intimate or personal of situations. And I think that's been really detrimental for politics, and I think it's been really detrimental, therefore, for people. That that I think there is a bit of a need for caution, but it doesn't mean that we can't behave like human beings, that we can't make mistakes. I had a debate about law. It was about constitutional reform in Manchester about a year ago, and I made some flippant remark about the House of Lords and said, just abolish it, sort of thing, and people were clapping, and there was a young lad at the back who was really furious with me, and he collared me afterwards, and he said, what do you mean abolish the House of Lords? You should know that as well as I do, that the House of Lords is often the place where you get the debate and you get the safeguard, and you get things passed that you can't get through the Commons because of the party system. And I said to him, actually I do, I know that really well, because I used to work with refugee and migrant children, and they were often, the Lords was where the proper conversation often happened. I said to him, I was just being really flippant, I'm sorry, I'm tired. And it's fine. I think you're absolutely right. We should be able to have that conversation with people and say, no, you're right, I'm wrong.
It's set up so that if a politician on Question Time goes, I've been thinking about this for months and months and months, and I'm stuck.
I haven't got a clue.
That would be on the front page, wouldn't it?
Yeah.
I haven't got a clue.
I'm not sure. I mean, I definitely think the media bears a fair bit of responsibility for it. I listen to the Today programme and I think, for God's sake, I actually want to know what this person is going to say. So, it'd be great for the interviewer to stop barracking them. I just want to know the answer. But I also think that we have some responsibility for it too. That actually you can say on interviews, I don't know, it's too complicated, I'd have to look at it, I don't know. And I mean, it's a bit different from saying I actually haven't got a clue, or I've never thought about it.
Yeah, no, that would probably be not the right thing.
But to say actually this is really complicated, I think people do. I mean, interviewers might not like it, but people do respond quite well to it. I had a debate recently with young people and Stephen Twigg, who is the Shadow Education Secretary, who was also my boss, and we were debating tuition fees. And I don't want to put words in his mouth, I'm not totally sure what his position is, but I think it is different to mine. I'd like to see us fund higher education through general taxation, but I'd also like to see us do a lot more to open up university to people from more disadvantaged backgrounds, and to not automatically assume that university is the right route for people from more privileged backgrounds, and to provide alternatives. And I think provided those two things go hand in hand, that's what I'd like to see. But there are other people in my party who have vastly different views, people who support tuition fees, people who support graduate tax. And one of the things that I was saying to these young people is, you might like what I'm saying, but you have to recognise that there are costs to what I'm saying. If I'm using a lot of money to pay for higher education, I might not be paying for Sure Start. Do you mind? Are you bothered? What are the trade-offs? And for people like me, you've always got to be asking me that question. And I think actually that's the point at which the debate came alive, when people were levelling and being honest with each other, and that actually it turned out they didn't all support funding higher education through general taxation. Some of them were violently against it, and it was just, once you start having that nuanced debate, once you start saying, look, this is what I want to do in principle, but the practicalities of it might be the wrong choice. What do you think? People respond really well to it.
Because I used to do citizens' juries and stuff at work.
Yeah.
If you just go with people's flash opinion, it'll be pretty shallow.
Yeah.
But given a few hours with some evidence, thinking about it, debating it, exploring it, there's something about inquiry, proper inquiry, which is about being specific rather than just making the sort of generalities, sort of sound bites that don't actually mean anything, which is why we've passed so many policies that really don't change anything. Because the policy was just a sound bite, there's nothing behind it.
Yeah, but wouldn't it be great if we could have those sorts of conversations out in the open, so that people could understand, that we understand as political parties, that these things are complicated, that, and that you could have a situation where Ed Miliband might start off saying one thing and arrive at a completely different conclusion, and say,
having heard the debate,
you've convinced me, and change his mind, and not have U-turn slapped across the front of the tabloids the next day, as if it was some kind of bad thing that he changed his mind. I think that would be a really good place to get to. It was one of my great hopes for the coalition. I didn't have huge hopes for the coalition, but it was one of the things that I really hoped would start to change, is that politics would have to become more fluid, There would have to be a greater recognition that issues are nuanced, that people in political parties hold different views, that there is a debate that is alive and well in Labour, in the Liberal Democrats, in the Greens, in the Conservatives, and it's been one of the biggest disappointments, I think, that it seems to have just reinforced that kind of black versus white debate, where the media will seize on disagreements between Nick Clegg and David Cameron, and it's all very exciting, but you know, why is that? Why is it a bad thing that we're having a discussion and that we're having a debate? It's a problem if you have such different value sets that you can't reach an agreement and you can't run the country. That is a real problem. But to actually be having the discussions, I think it's got to be a good thing, isn't it?
Well, and you know, we've elected as parliamentarians people who are good at talking, we hope, and good at thinking, and
not very good at listening.
You know, so actually, the opportunity to see where they get to when they think together would be really, really interesting. And for me, it wouldn't just be within a particular party. Actually, the exchange between parties. What does Plaid Cymru think that's different to what the Greens think that's different to? I don't know.
Or similar as well. I mean, you know, over the last 3.5 years, I've worked with people in my own party whose values I really strongly share, but I've also worked with other politicians from other parties whose values I think are broadly similar to mine. So people like Martin Horwood and Julian Huppert in the Lib Dems, people like Caroline Lucas, and I've worked with Zach Goldsmith on some of the environmental agenda and the actions of British multinationals, where we have really similar views and values, and it's an opportunity to push things forward. And while you might not agree with those people on a whole host of other things, you know, the Lib Dems and I fell out over constitutional reform and so on, but broadly speaking, I think we do have some commitments to social justice that we share, and I think that's a real strength, that you can work together across parties. I come from a background where I used to represent refugee and migrant children, and before that young homeless teenagers, and I think in those roles you work with whoever you can find some broad consensus with to get things done. You don't have the luxury of saying, I'll just work with the people who've got the same badge as me, because change has to happen for those people, and it has to happen really, really fast. And it's those sorts of values that I think I brought into Parliament, but so did many other people from different parties. And when you can work together and you can find consensus, it's really exciting, and I'd love the public to be able to see more of that. I'm not arguing that disagreement isn't important. I think it's really, really important that we clash against each other, and out of that clash we get to the right place. But I also think that those sort of broad values that we share, people don't see that very often. They see Prime Minister's questions, they see all the screaming and the shouting and the name calling. But what they don't see is when, you know, I'm sitting in a room with a Green, a Liberal Democrat and a Conservative working out how we're going to get something changed.
What for you is the good life?
One of the reasons I love being the MP for Wigan is because there is a sense of community and there is a sense of solidarity. I don't want to live in the sort of community or society or country where people don't look out for each other, where we step over people on the street and go about our lives quite happily without worrying about what happens to other people. I just don't want to be part of that. So the good life for me is more of that.